We live in what seems like an increasingly unstable world. In a world in crisis, how do we cope with anxiety and live resilient, meaningful lives? Dr. Christopher Peet argues that one of the answers might lie in axial age spirituality. What is axial age spirituality, and how can it help us cope with anxiety? This is the topic for today's podcast. Christopher Peet is Professor of Psychology at King's University in Edmonton. His most recent book is called Practicing Transcendence, Axial Age Spiritualities for a World in Crisis. Before we start, the following conversation is not intended as medical advice, nor do we claim that spiritual practices are a substitute for therapy, counseling, or medicine. Lastly, I'd like to remind you to please subscribe, like, and hit the notification button to watch more videos like this. Christopher Peet, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to have you. In your book, you argue that we can learn a great deal from axial age spirituality. What is the axial age? And then secondly, what can we learn from these forms of spiritual practice that emerged from this era?
What is the axial age? Now, the word axial, A-X-I-A-L, comes from the word axis, which if you think of your XY axis in math, pretty simple image. It's the axis is a dividing line. But Karl Jaspers, who's a German, he's a psychologist first, but more well known as an existential philosopher, he uses the phrase axial age, and he uses this image of a dividing line. And what he says is, in the wake of World War II, in the beginning of the atomic age, on which he wrote books, is like World War II was a terrifying global event of enormous violence and fear, right? The threat of an Adolf Hitler and Nazis taking over the world, for example, is very end of the world stuff. Fortunately, the good guys won the war. But, in reflecting on that after the fact, Jaspers says, we are at a stage in world history, and I think this remains to be true until the present day. It just gets added on to with the climate crisis. But we are at a stage in world history where we really need to get our bearings. And how do you get your bearings in world history? It's such a huge sweep of time and events, and you get lost and consumed in it all. Well, he says there's a way to stand back. He says we need a sort of point in time in history where we can gain our bearings from. And drawing on about 200 years of scholarship, which has made this claim, Jaspers elaborates on it, and he says there is a period in time in history where you can see this dividing line, where before there's the character of how we think and believe, and then after that character is qualitatively different. And that period in time, so it's like a dividing line, and geologists will often use dividing lines, right? You have those fancy words like the Paleozoic and the Paleolithic and the Jurassic and all that sort of thing. And there's a dividing line before and after, and then they have different names for them. But Jaspers' claim is during the axial age, they were in the middle of that dividing line. And I think there's so much interest in this thesis, my own interest as well, is because we are now arguably in another axial age. We are in a dividing line in history that in 500 years' time, people might look back and say, the 20th century, the 21st century, it was a major dividing line in history. Before, the world wasn't really global and technology was quite limited and industry was relatively limited, et cetera. After, you have technology and industry and science and these global phenomena, and the world changes dramatically over the span of 200 years, something like that. Those of us who are living within this time, 200 years is greater than our lifespan. But it means that living within the dividing line, it's a very volatile time of great uncertainty, great anxiety, end of the world anxiety. And so Jaspers locates, following the scholarship and then in specifying it somewhat, he locates the first axial age that he writes about in the centuries 800 to 200 BC. And he says that is the time when many great thinkers, great spiritual leaders, great religious leaders, great philosophers lived, who changed the quality of our thinking and being. And he cites and here's the Axial Age thesis, he cites the philosophers in ancient Greece, like a Plato or a Socrates or a Pythagoras, who lived in the centuries 800 to 200. He cites the ancient prophets of ancient Israel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, right? The great names in the Bible. Again, 800 to 200 BC. He cites the Buddha in India, as well as Mahavira, who is the founder of Jainism. The Buddha founds Buddhism, as well as many writers of the Upanishads, which is like the Hindu scriptures, to use that sort of Western version of how to describe it. Again, it's the years 800 to 200. And then in China, you have Confucius. Later, you have Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu. You have Mencius or Meng Tzu. You have the great founders of Chinese civilization and Confucianism and Taoism. Again, it's those same centuries. And he says the before then, you have a certain character of the worldview of China and India and Persia and in Africa and in Rome and in Egypt, and all of these civilizations have a certain quality to their mythology. It's very regional. It's very local. It's relatively anthropocentric or anthropomorphic in terms of how it understands gods. But then you get these prophets, these philosophers, these sages in China. You have these holy men in India. And there's sort of a family resemblance, despite great differences. There's a family resemblance across all of them in that they question the mythology radically. You get articulations of atheism, which is very different than the polytheism of before. You also get monotheism, such as Judaism, and later Christianity, and later Islam will have, which is very different from the polytheism of before. You also get a lot more rational questioning about, like, how did it begin? Why did it begin that way? Why is there so much evil in the world? And the old mythologies kind of say that's just the way it is because of the gods. In the Axial Age, they say, no, it's wrong, that the God cannot be evil like this. There must be like a devil who's evil or something. And you get the philosophers who question, the anthropomorphism of our... And then afterwards, the quality of mythology is changed in those places, and it spreads, and it spreads, and it spreads. And then today, the majority of people belong to Christianity, Islam, that's the two biggest, Judaism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. So a different way of talking about the Axial Ages. That's the beginning of what we today call the world religions. And that's Jaspers talks about this. So there's a clear before and after in those centuries is his argument.
And then in your book,
to answer your first question, that is the Axial Age.
And the reason this age is important for you is because you're concerned with many of the spiritual practices that emerged from this era, and you categorize these very diverse practices as practicing transcendence.
Well, if the first brief characterization of the Axial Age made sense, what scholarship, including Jaspers, have emphasized throughout for a few hundred years now, but especially the last 50 years, because there's much more intensive examination of the Axial Age thesis about whether it's a good thesis or bad thesis. What they've really emphasized, and this is the shorthand summary of the Axial Age, that in these centuries, in these places, there was a breakthrough to the idea of transcendence. That's the shorthand summary of what is the Axial Age. That's what it is. When was it? Those centuries. Who was it? Those individuals named. What was it? A sociological movement. At the center, it's a breakthrough to a new way of thinking, right? So they often use a metaphor of a horizon that's then broken through to a higher way or a more complex way of thinking. I don't think that's untrue. But when you look at how, the philosophers like a Socrates or a Pythagoras or a Plato lived, or the prophets in ancient Israel, or Jesus or John the Baptist, or Confucius or Buddha, if you look at how they lived, yes, they were great philosophers and thinkers on the one hand. They had parables or aphorisms or stories or anecdotes or philosophical arguments, right, that are quite intellectually profound. But I would guess most people, when you hear, let's say, Jesus or Buddha, you don't immediately think, oh, an intellectually profound philosopher. That's not untrue, but it's not the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that probably comes to mind with, let's say, the Buddha is, well, he meditated a lot. You see these postures of the Buddha, and he had these disciples around him who also meditated. And the first image that probably comes to mind when you hear Jesus is, well, he heals and he travels and he preaches with a small group of disciples, and they pray a lot. They're constantly praying. They go off into the wilderness to pray, and they come back. And if you know the philosophers well enough, your first image is of intellectuals, big heads. But when you look carefully at how they actually live, like a Plato or a Pythagoras, I mean, Pythagoras is a mystic who wears white and practices vegetarianism and isolates himself from mainstream society to live in a small community. And Plato sets up an academy outside of the city in a forest where he has small groups of people. And if anything, it looks more like a cult than a philosopher's group. And so my point is, well, if we look at those actual age people and how they lived, what was really important to them was how they practiced their life, not first and foremost how they thought. Now, those are inseparable. And so what is it that they practiced? So my argument is that they didn't think the idea of transcendence. They practiced a way of being that transformed themselves to live transcendentally. Now, what does living transcendentally mean? And here, pause for a moment. If you just hold on to that question and insert your own answer, I'm going to live transcendentally, you will probably have some very highfalutin ideas about what that looks like. But in fact, it's really simple. It is that, you, to use the Christian description, you love your neighbor. And that is a transcendent way of living. It's not selfish and egocentric. It means you need to transcend what? You need to transcend your selfish, petty little egocentrisms in order to love your neighbor, which, admit it, is hard to do. Your neighbor is obnoxious. You don't like the way he gardens or the way she gardens. You don't like his or her decor. You're glad you have a big fence between yourself and them. And you don't really love them as much as you love yourself. And if your neighbor is very different than you, I don't know, have black skin or practice a different religion or have brown skin or have pointy eyes, slanted eyes, or, racism is prominent, right? There's all sorts of ways in which we do not love our neighbors because we cannot transcend our own egocentrism, our own ethnocentrism. Right? The Buddha says compassion for all other living beings. Right? The philosophers of Greece says, actually, we're all equal. We're all, not all of them do, but many of them did. And they said, even a slave, even a woman, even a barbarian can think rationally if they are trained in the right way. And why are we thinking rationally? Well, because so much of what we do is self-centered and evil. For the Greek philosophers, the center of the problem is our human desires. And we need to transcend our selfish desires in order to have a transcendent desire for what is good, what is true, what is noble, what is beautiful. And so, but how do you do that? It's one thing to preach it. That's easy to do. It's hard to practice it. And so my argument in the book is that the essence of the actual age is not this idea of transcendence. The essence is a systematic, sustained practice over time that teaches you what transcendence is. And so for the Buddha, which is the easiest example because it's most well known, is the Buddha meditates a lot. But the Old Testament prophets are always disappearing into the wilderness to pray for days on end, not just for an hour, not just for 5 minutes, right? When you begin, you're a Christian or a Jew, and you begin eating, you say, let's pray. They don't mean let's pray for the next 3 days and nights, right? You get very hungry and your food will get cold, right? So one form of prayer is just, verbal prayer, personal verbal prayer where you talk to God. But there is a very strong argument from the scholarship that what is also practiced as a form of prayer is for days on end, like the monks in Egypt who found monasticism. Right? How did they pray? They didn't recite the Lord's Prayer on end. Maybe some did, but a lot of it is contemplative prayer. And we know the Greek philosophers did this. We know that the Buddhists and the Hindus did this, the Confucians and the Taoists did this. And we know that the Old Testament prophets did some version or form of this. And certainly by the time of Jesus in the New Testament, they were practicing contemplative prayer, as it gets called today, from the Latin contemplatio. And it is a practice where you work against your own ego's way of being in order to transcend it. So what I'm really blocking, one avenue I'm blocking that I've already mentioned is this really intellectual, philosophical version of it. Another one I'm really blocking is some like Hollywood special effects supernatural version of it, where it's like, oh, now I'm experiencing transcendence, like God and all of his angels are singing around me. Well, the Abba, the abbot of the monastery who heard you say this would say, you should pray some more, because it's not about glorifying yourself at all. Like it becomes very simple. Like, do you manifest the outcome of this practice by being more loving of your neighbor, by being more forgiving, by giving away your shirt to someone who needs it because they have none, so in very concrete, simple actions of selflessness and selfless giving is the fruits of transcendence. And that there's nothing supernatural about any of the things I've just said.
And in fact, most people would probably think, when they hear the word transcendence, they'd probably think of something that takes us out of this world.
Yes. And I talk a lot in the book about what exactly is meant by otherworldly. And if you are a spiritual practitioner, then the otherworldliness is a very down-to-earth transformation of your way of being on this earth. Whereas if you're not a practitioner, ironically, I think you're much more susceptible to very, egocentric projections of what you think transcendence is. And transcendence is something dramatic. Transcendence has, I wasn't entirely joking when I talked about special effects. Like if you were to depict it in a Hollywood movie, there would be light, there would be white, and there would be like very dramatic, magical stuff that happens. People appear in the clouds or whatever. Well, the spiritual practitioners are filled with descriptions of these sorts of experiences. And accompanying those descriptions are, this is not what it's about. This is you being immature in your practice, needing to overcome that. There's a very famous Buddhist parable about someone who goes to see, the master, the Zen master or whatever, the Tibetan master up in the Himalayas. And they said, oh, I've been meditating for a year now, and it, like my bones ache and it's really difficult. And the master says, just go back and meditate some more. And he comes back 5 years later and he says, I know what enlightenment is now. Like the Buddha was singing, all of the angels were singing, and I had enlightenment. And the master says, that's very nice. Now go back and meditate some more. And eventually, and often the realization is very counterintuitive to what the egocentric person thinks it's going to be. It is something very seemingly minor. But for the accomplished practitioner, they realize that no, this woman who has gone to church and given $1 to the church, but it's all she makes in a week. Her gift to the church is far greater than this millionaire who's given $100,000, because it's in the quality of the meaning of what you do. And in giving that $1, and it's all she had, she is being selfless. And it's not special effects, it's not fireworks, it's not grand philosophical theory on the one hand, of some intellectual, nor is it some like supernatural otherworldliness. It is a transfiguration, if you like, where the light that is around us all the time, a God that is ever present, omnipresent in the world around us, is seen by the person, is allowed to manifest by the person. Like if we truly believe that God is in everything and everyone at all times, we ought to behave very differently than we do. We ought to be filled with gratitude. We wouldn't sin nearly so much. We would, there's a long list of how we ought to behave, and yet we don't. Why not? And it's because we haven't transformed our very being. So in that sense, the other world, I retain the language of this world and other world. But my argument is that the practice of transcendence transforms this world into the other world. But in some ways, it doesn't look any different. But the inner meaning of this world, like you suddenly see the man begging on the side of the road and realize, no, this is not someone for me to be afraid of and run away from and ignore. This is the face of God. And how should you respond to the face of God? Well, I don't know. You sit down and talk with him. I'm not saying you give him money, but like you interact with him like an equal and a fellow human being. And that would be a transformation of this world into God's world, into an otherworldly. And I think it's very puzzling in the same way that many of Jesus' parables are puzzling. Like often the parable seems quite mundane. Right? The Samaritan is a good person because he stopped and helped that injured person on the side of the road. Not the priest and not the Levite and not the the supposedly pious holy person according to the institutions. This Samaritan who doesn't even belong to the religion is a good person because he did something good for that other person.
And just to summarize this, what you've been talking about, I love your definition of transcendence in the book. You write that transcendence is the conscious experience of reality without the ego at the center of that experience.
Yes,
and
way very simple.
Yeah,
but practically very hard to attain. Yeah,
and that's kind of it's a negative definition in the sense that it's saying what should not be at the center of experience, but it's as if you get rid of that ego, or if you somehow overcome that egocentrism, it opens you up to new kinds of experiences, the kinds of experiences that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. But they are only new relative to the ego.
Right.
They are as old as the world itself, as old as creation. And then we could go right back to Genesis 1 and look at that. And what is God's relation to the world? I mean, it is very good. All of it. Look at it. It's very good. Like you should be filled with joy at the beauty of this world and filled with love. And in John 3, verse 16, which in some ways is like Christianity in a nutshell, in a single verse, it begins with, "For God so loved this world." Now, he doesn't love this world because he's egocentric and it makes him feel good or whatever. He loves the world in itself, for like he's willing to give up what he loves, what he should love more than anything, for this world. So that is I think a statement of conscious experience without the ego at the center. And in a way, it's a totally new experience to our egocentric selves, our sinful selves, to use Christian language. Our egocentric selves, that's a very new kind of experience. But in some ways, it's just the world as it's always been, which doesn't need to be changed, which doesn't need to be improved upon, it's to be enjoyed, it's to be loved, it's to be gazed upon, to be immersed in. And so it's this world is egocentric. The other world is this very same world, but it's transfigured. It is, and I think, when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is not some supernatural place out there. It's within you. It's among us, depending how you translate that verse. It sort of both seem to work. Like suddenly it becomes in a way a very mundane thing. But if you say, "Oh, it's within me, it's my ego," like, no. It is the world experienced without your ego in it.
Very good. Let's connect this discussion now with what we were talking about earlier, anxiety, end of the world anxiety, or perhaps even just anxiety in general. How does practicing transcendence in this way help us in terms of anxiety?
Well, I think in many ways you could argue that ordinary psychotherapy is always about narrating an anxious ego to a healthier place. And often that healthier place, well, I would say almost always that healthier place is just less egocentric. So you could argue that a basic, I don't want to call it a trick because it's good, a basic wisdom of psychotherapy is that to get someone to decenter to some extent, to start to, so a lot of, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very popular these days in North America, is a rational way of working with your own ego to kind of talk yourself out of your narrow egocentric anxiety into an appreciation of from a more decentered place of, I can handle this. It's not so dramatic as I thought. Others have gone through this. Like basic to successful psychotherapy is trust. If you cannot trust your psychotherapist, the psychotherapy won't work very well. But in order to learn to trust, you have to let go of some of your egocentric paranoia and fear. And, group therapy, which is very effective for many anxieties and problems we have, very effective for addictions. A lot of it is that it brings you out of your narrow individual egocentric focus. And you just, what is it that you're doing? You're sharing with other people. And in the sharing is the therapeutic effectiveness. Not 100% or anything, but to a great degree. So if we take a step back from that and sort of say, well, what is the commonality here that's going on? And here's where the psychology, the psychotherapy kind of blurs into spirituality, is that spirituality says the enemy is your own ego. We have to overcome ourselves in order to enter into a right relationship with God or with the Tao, if you're Taoist or Confucian, or with the Brahman, if you're Hindu, or in the most extreme case in Buddhism, that you don't actually have a self at all. You are nothing but an interconnected piece of all of everything. In all of those, there is a very strong, overt worldview that says, you are not at the center. You are not at the center. Like God's goodness is at the center, or the goodness of the cosmos is at the center. And so there it's much stronger that you must confront and overcome the ego. But what is the consequence of that? The people who have done that are invariably described in the literature and throughout history as full of joy and bliss. Like monks are famous for just laughing a lot and being easygoing. And like the saint, maybe there are some saints who are considered like doer, but they're not like unhappy, right? If they're doer, it's because it's kind of their personality and that's what they're like. But when they talk about God, I mean, they talk about joy, they talk about light, they talk about peace, they talk about equanimity, they talk about all of these positive, virtuous ways of being in the world. And from a psychological point of view, the commonality to all of them, I would argue, is that they've transcended their egocentrism. Now, does it mean the ego has gone? No, they still have their personalities, but their personalities are not at the center. And in this way, I think, when you're in love with someone, and this is very much, when Jesus says, suffer the little children, like, what does it mean to suffer the little children? It means you put yourself aside and you let the child be at the center stage. That's to suffer the little children. What is it to suffer the oppressed? Is you suppress your own desire to be center stage and you let them speak. If you go on a date, to use an example that, maybe students in their early 20s can really relate to. If you go on a date and all you do is talk to your date and you never I'm a man, so I'm going to use a gendered example with a woman. If you do all the talking and she never says a word, I don't think you might leave that saying that was a great date, but she's not going to say that. Like a better date would be that where there's better to and fro, and you need to stop that speaking voice in order to let the other speak. And in spiritual practice, that's very much what you're doing, right? What is Christian contemplation? It is you are silencing yourself. It is you are practicing interior stillness. Psalm 46, verse 10, be still and know that I am God. In order to hear God speak, you have to stop your own ego from doing all the talking. So all of us are on really bad dates with God. We just talk about ourselves endlessly, and then we're anxious about ourselves endlessly, and we worry about ourselves endlessly. Well, what does Jesus say? He says, well, look at the lilies of the field. They have no anxiety at all because they have no ego at all. He doesn't say that, but that's my interpretation. Mm-hmm. And God is taking care of them. So why are we so anxious? God will take care of us too. Mm-hmm. Well, when we're too egocentric, we're worried that it's not enough, or it's not right. Or so I do think there's a way to seamlessly blend the psychology that leads into the spirituality. And the psychology is very much about the means and mechanisms of understanding how that works. And it will often stop at the ego. And it will say in therapy, we're moving an unhealthy ego into being a healthy ego. And that's conventional psychology. But I think conventional psychology should pay attention to the wisdom of our spiritual traditions. And they would say, good up to that point. But now what is the job of the healthy ego? Well, it's not to put itself at the center of things. It is now to transcend itself for the sake of the other, for the sake of the animals of the world, for the sake of the suffering, for the sake of all of us, and ultimately for the sake of a God. So the conventional psychology, I would argue, should lead into a contemplative psychology, which eventually will give way to a contemplative spirituality.
That's very interesting, because I think a lot of people, when they think of these spiritual practices like prayer, like contemplative prayer or meditation, or some of these philosophical practices, is that those practices are egocentric, that they're focused on the self. It's about going inward and moving away from the world. But you're arguing that it's actually in the end moves in a different direction.
Yes, very strongly. I mean, I've always found it's an old saw, and it's still quite funny that Buddhism, which is the ultimate spirituality around there is no self, that's the realization you should come to, which has all sorts of positive effects psychologically on the self, right? A selfless person is not filled with anxiety. But the irony is, do you find the majority of Buddhist psychology books in the bookstore? In the self-help section. Mm-hmm. Like somehow there's something being missed or misunderstood here. And I call this the egocentric misunderstanding of spirituality. Mm-hmm. And spiritual literature itself is filled with admonitions against that misunderstanding, because they know from experience that's how it will be misunderstood. Rather than meditate in order to realize you have no self, or rather than contemplate God in order to overcome your sinful self, you will use that practice to glorify yourself. Right? Look at me. Look how spiritual I am. You will egocentrically appropriate the spirituality, right? It's called spiritual materialism by some people. Or you will use it to bypass real problems psychologically you have, which is called spiritual bypassing. There's all sorts of ways for the ego to trick and misuse spiritual practice wrongly. But I think, and here's why it's very important that the practice be grounded in a tradition, rather than you make it up yourself. Be grounded in a community, rather than just, I am going to do this by myself, and be grounded in a practice. Because the practice is the thing that really works against that ego aggrandizement or ego enlargement or ego enhancement that we want to do. But I think you're absolutely right. There is a very interesting egocentric misunderstanding of spirituality, and then it will try to appropriate it for its own means. The other piece that's interesting here, and you mentioned the inwardness. A lot of the Axial Age is about inwardness. That in terms of that dividing line, before there wasn't really a distinction between the inner and the outer. I mean, if you brought your offering, your sacrifice to the idol and burned it in front of the idol, you did your religious duty. It didn't matter what you were thinking about. Right? Whereas with the Axial Age, they say, well, the sacrifice is a bad sacrifice if in your heart you are still harboring evil or selfishness or greed. But what happens, I think, today very strongly in the West is that inwardness has come to mean this sort of inside you as an individual. And I'm certain that's not what is meant at all. What is meant by inwardness is sort of the invisible quality that makes something what it is. So you plant a seed in the ground. Let's say you don't know what it is. You plant a seed in the ground and you nurture it and you watch it grow, and it's going to become a sunflower, or it's going to become a lily, or it's going to become a tree. Like, how does it know what to become? Well, that's the inwardness of the seed. And similarly, we all have an inner quality, which we can call our spirit. But when you go inward to find the kingdom of heaven, you shouldn't find an individual ego solitarily enclosed in upon itself. That's the conventional lie, I would say. We can trace that back to Descartes very strongly, and what we've done with Descartes since then. Inwardness for a spiritual person is a certain quality of being that is crucial for your relationship with others. For example, it's crucial for authenticity in your love relationships or in your faith relationships. But authenticity in relationship has some individuality there, but it is clearly not some sort of self-enclosed individual. It is, if anything, an openness to the world around you. And I think that's what spiritual practice wants you to develop. So you go inward, and not to cut yourself off from the world, ironically, but the opposite is to uncover all of your self-deceptions and inauthenticities that you constantly are living by, those projections onto the world that prevent you from having a real relationship to it.
Right.
But most of us live outwardly, and here it's like the senses and what you see outside you and the actions you take. And what really matters, pun intended, within that is the quality with which you do it. Like, is it true love, right? And you can say, well, I said I loved you 100 yesterday. I gave you roses, and I bought you a nice dress, and I bought you some bling. Is that the truth, the authenticity of love? Well, ultimately, it's kind of mysterious in how you determine that. Yeah. You can't show it in that way. But if you're in a trust relationship together, you can say, yeah, he really loves me. And you can always look at the outward side. Notice the language. It's so hard to avoid this outward, inward. You can look at the outward signs, but what we really want is the inner spirit that animates those signs, that makes them true. Yeah. And to use the example of the really colloquial example of loving another person, you can have multiple suitors, right? And there's lots of fairy tales and stories about this, right? Like the woman will choose the one true suitor who truly loves her, and often there'll be some sort of interesting, wonderful story that's kind of accidental that will show the person's love, right? And there's going to be outward signs, but the way in which they're animated is what makes it real. And the inauthentic lover or suitor will have all of the signs, but ultimately in his heart he's still selfish. It's a trophy wife or something, right? Yeah. And so I do think that there is subtlety here in discernment that you need to engage in if you want to get at that inner quality. And again, how do you become good at that kind of subtle discernment? Well, again, it's a practice, and it would be a spiritual practice. And the Christian tradition, of course, is filled with examples of spiritual practices of discernment and different traditions that we can call upon that are practices of discernment in terms of discerning whether the spirit is truly there or not.
And that actually leads to one of my questions. So that this conversation isn't purely theoretical, something that you caution against. For people listening today to this, do you have any practical advice if they want to start engaging in some of these spiritual practices? Now, that's a very difficult question because there's so many different traditions. But is there anything you could, just as a first step at least, if they want to live a more spiritually disciplined life?
Yes. I think it's actually not that hard of a question. I think one really important thing here, and part of what my book is also about, and what a lot of the scholars I really admire and read are about, is they say one of the really important things to do right now, in the present, in this somewhat unprecedented time, in this unprecedented time with all of our anxieties and so much newness and so much change and so much volatility and so many unknowns. One important thing is to retrieve what is good from our traditions plural. Christianity is not a single monolithic tradition. It's a diversity of many different traditions, as is Buddhism, as is Confucianism, as is secularism. And then the notion that let's retrieve something that is good. And one of the things that we really need to retrieve, which has fallen off of our radar, I would say, in the last couple of centuries in Christianity, is we need to retrieve those spiritual practices that ground us, that transform our spirit, and that build our resilience. And yes, they will have the psychological side effect of anxiety reduction, stress reduction. They improve our immune systems. They have all sorts of egocentric benefits. And I wouldn't argue against that. But I would argue, be on your guard here, that this isn't just about you. That ultimately the outcome of sustained spiritual practice is you become I was told this after a couple of years. I do centering prayer, which is a practice was developed by Thomas Keating and a couple others in the 70s into the 80s. And it's one form of Christian spiritual practice that has a long pedigree, arguably 2,000 years old, arguably 500 years old, depending on how you argue it. But regardless, it's something that you can retrieve from the Christian tradition. And it's a very simple practice on the one hand. You sit still in silence. It's a practice of silence and stillness where you give consent to God's action to work within you, and you work against your own ego intruding. There's also a different form of contemplative practice called Christian meditation, developed by John Main, and it's a different variation on that theme. Ignatius has an entire book called Spiritual Exercises, written in the 16th century, where he outlines many different contemplative exercises to undertake. But in every case, you retrieve a certain practice. You don't usually do it on your own. You find a small community. I found quite easily small communities of practitioners that I join on a once-a-week basis. I've started a number of groups in my university where I invite students in to do this, and they learn about it. For many of them, it's entirely new, but it's actually old. And you retrieve it and you bring it into your contemporary practice today. So for a Christian, I would argue a thing to do is to expand your notion of prayer beyond the conventional forms and do some research into some other forms and retrieve some of those and practice them regularly. And beyond Christianity, I would say all the religions of the world should be doing this. I mean, most Buddhists don't meditate every day. They go to the Buddhist temple and they give food to the priests or the monks, and and giving the food and attending the monastery is their religious service, just like people go to church. Now, I have nothing that's going to church. I go to church myself. I have nothing that's going to monasteries. I've been in a monastery myself. But it's not the going to it, the outward action of doing that alone, which is enough. Like, I would say most Buddhists of the world should practice Buddhist meditation. I would say most Hindus, sure, you go to the temple, you bring your incense, you bring your offering, you pay some money, you do the worship service with your fellow Hindus. But in addition, Hinduism has these sophisticated spiritual practices of different types of yoga. Like, practice that as well, in addition to your communal worship service, in addition to going to church on Sunday. And here, I think, really to move back to Christianity as an example, what does Paul mean when he says, pray without ceasing? Like, if you understand prayer in the conventional form of saying a verbal prayer, like let's say the Lord's Prayer, like, no one does that because we need to work. We need to go to school. And like, we wouldn't get too far if all we did was say the Lord's Prayer while we're at work. Like, it's like, hey, you're a CEO at a meeting, like, stop saying the Lord's Prayer. Like, you're going to be fired, right? So none of us pray without ceasing. But in the contemplative tradition, prayer is a way of being in relation to God. And if you practice regularly, daily, over months and years, you become better and better able at sustaining that state. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're lecturing, whether you're sitting at a dinner table with someone, whether you're at a business, whether you're in a restaurant. It doesn't matter what outward action you're doing. You're able to sustain that inner way of being, which holds your ego at bay. Your ego's not gone, but it's not dominating at the center. It is open and listening and fully present to what's going on. That is contemplative prayer. And if you can cultivate that state of being fully, openly present at all times, even while you're washing dishes or while you're at a business meeting or in a sense, you are praying. And you can do that without ceasing, even as you go about your ordinary life. And someone who does that, I mean, people would remark on that. They would say, oh, he's a bit of a saintly person, or he's like those people gain our admiration for being like model examples or exemplars of leading a spiritual life, right? So think right now of a concrete person who's like, yeah, he's not reactive. He has this wonderful ability to really listen and to be present no matter who he's with. And he always has that, or she, right? Well, what is that capacity? Like, part of the argument here is it's a capacity that can be trained and practiced. It's not theoretical. It's not intellectual. It's very practical, as in the most practical effects initially of centering prayer, let's say, sustained over a long period of time, is a transformation in your personality that you become more easygoing, less sharp, more humorous, better able to listen, better, like you are better able to cultivate qualities in your relationship that are good.
Right. Very good point. In fact, each of the traditions that we've been discussing have traditions that teach people how to be contemplative even in daily life.
That's right.
So it's not just retreating somewhere, although those are important too. Those kind of practices are important, but that's not the only kinds of practices that we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And retreat is very common. Almost all of them do retreat.
Yeah.
And there are extremes who like retreat for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Right. There are extremes who like starve themselves to death.
And people and these traditions also recognize that people are at different stages in their spiritual development.
Very much so. And so for those who don't retreat so extremely, you retreat in order to like renew yourself and rejuvenate yourself, because you do get tired of like being in quote this world all the time. And you need to retreat. And often they retreat to places that are natural. Often they retreat to places that are quiet. They go to the desert, they go to the forest, they go on top of a mountain, they go to a river. But then they return. Like they retreat in order to return. So it isn't one or the other.
Right.
And then, monastics are a special case. They retreat permanently, but they do so in order to do a service to the non-monastic world that will come and visit them.
Yeah.
And there's interesting complexities here. But yeah, the notion that you would build it, like, what is 20 minutes of prayer every morning, like I should be doing and try to do? It's hard to do during COVID. What is that? That is a retreat within the context of the day, in order that I can go back into the rest of my day more renewed and restored. And so to build retreat, prayer into your life, silence, right? Why is it so hard to practice 20 minutes of silence compared to the 12 hours of noise? It's really hard to do. Why is that? Well, because your ego loves the noise. Now, ironically, your ego's stressed out by it, and at a different level, a different voice other than your egocentric voice will tell you to retreat. And if you can cultivate it and keep a habit of it and build on that, more and more you will see the fruits. More and more you will gain resilience. More and more you will be able to confront anxiety, because not all anxiety goes away. A lot of your false superficial anxiety goes away. But there are real anxieties in the world today. You can have real anxieties about the mental health of your children, real anxieties about the physical illness of a spouse. Oh, someone was in a car accident. Like, there's lots of reason for real anxiety. And remember the climate crisis we started with. There's a real anxiety there. Think of the protests around racism, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, finding these horrific stories of mass graves of children in Canada in our schools. Like, there's horrific things going on that cause real anxiety. That doesn't go away because you're enlightened, but your relationship to it transforms dramatically, and you were able to live with it differently. You were able to bring spiritual goodness to it in a way that we need to help transform how we relate to it and what we're going to do about it. And so, yes, ideally, the contemplative outcome, no, is not fireworks and you're all wearing white up in the clouds. It's not like that at all, nor is it some elaborate, amazing philosophy that you get praised for. But the real outcome of contemplation is that would infuse your life with a better quality, a more spiritual quality, a more virtuous or righteous or good quality.
Because ego is not at the center of your actions.
because you are consciously experiencing the world, including the things that cause anxiety.
Yeah.
But without your ego at the center of it, how does someone respond to anxiety? Like something that's anxiety inducing, if their ego is not at the center. Usually you will open your arms and embrace it, because that's what this anxious person needs right now.
Yeah.
But most of us, the Mother Teresas of the world or the Jesuses of the world, they can embrace a leper. But most of us, why are we afraid to embrace the leper? Well, I am scared. I'm afraid. But perfect love drives out fear.
Yeah.
Can we perfectly love? Well, I can't, but maybe with enough practice, I can get closer and closer to it. So yes, I think love and fear are stances we take that we practice. And if we're not aware, we will unconsciously practice fear all the time and get really good at it. Or we can try to reverse that, and we can try to practice a more loving, open relationship. And that's a spiritual practice that we can become better at it.
You've talked about centering prayer. Are there any other ways that you are, in your own personal life, practicing transcendence?
Yes. Well, taking action, I guess, for sure. It was very hard to work on this book. And the world anxiety is not an easy thing for me to deal with, or anyone. And really with the pandemic, it's really accelerated a lot of those concerns. So yeah, I have been taking action. I published the book that we've been talking about all through this 2 years ago, about which I was very happy, but it's also dissatisfying in a lot of ways, because it just sort of is out there and then it doesn't manifest in more action. Last year, I made a podcast, which was with a couple of alumni of King's. And that was more satisfying in a lot of ways, because there's more engagement with others and you get immediate responses from others. But really the pandemic has been, a kick in the butt. And so what I've done actually, and I'm on a sabbatical, and this is what my sabbatical plan is I am in the process of obtaining some land 1 hour outside of the city. And I have formulated an institute that I call the Institute for Contemplative Ecology. You'll notice the word contemplative is in there. But it's an institute that brings together contemplative spiritual practices with ecological wisdom and ecological awareness, and tries to think and do those two together. And it's all in process and being founded, but it's very much going to be a center for education and retreat and research that I as an Edmontonian will retreat to regularly and often. But also I want to set up retreat programs and education programs where it can help people to transition out of our very industrial, individualistic, extractive resource, global economy ways of living and being, and through the contemplation and ecological awareness, to really help people to transform into a post-industrial, more communal, and above all, more ecological way of living.
That's very interesting. Christopher Peet, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a very enlightening discussion. We really appreciate it.
You are very welcome. My only wish is we had a lot more time, because there's so much good stuff to be talking about.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.